This wall is the reason that upwards of 300 people survived the night of the Tulsa riots. C.R. Tucker was a pastor in the 20s, and he had commissioned to have this built like this, not knowing that it was going to be needed. Recently, a pastor wanted to change this room to this rendition, but the history was so rich until the congregation didn't want to see the change come about. This has to be remembered. It was a rumor that changed the landscape of Greenwood forever.
Right here in the Greenwood area, over 100 years ago, Simon Berry had airplanes. 6 black people had airplanes in 1921 in Tulsa. 32 grocery stores, 21 restaurants, and J.B. Stratford had hotels here in Tulsa.
According to information from the Greenwood Cultural Center, word spread that a 19-year-old black male assaulted a 17-year-old white female. Dick Rollins was arrested, and the word went out that he was to be lynched by a white mob. The black community stood its ground, which inflamed the mob. The accusations eventually proved erroneous, but not before hundreds of people were killed and the community burned to the ground. They were just gunning down black people, just picking them off like they were swatting flies. We ran for our lives. We never saw my stepfather again. I just know they perished in that riot. My stepfather was a strong family man. I know he did not desert us. I just wish I knew where he was buried. Otis Granfield Clark, born February 13th, 1903. The Vernon AME Church pastor Keith Mays says lives are still being impacted because of that massacre. S.M. Jackson, the great uncle of the Jackson Five, owned a funeral home prior to the heinous action, but that was burned down. The chairs from the business were donated to the church, the only building left standing after the smoke cleared. The chairs are still there.
When they constructed this basement, people could understand why they fortified it. And maybe they didn't know, but God was already in it. And where we're sitting now as a part of that original structure, the support columns here in the very room that we're in, you can see the fire indention from the actual bombings. It's still here. And so it was reconstructed beginning 3 days after the massacre. Those resilient people started rebuilding this, and by the next year it was back up.
One of those with ancestry connected to the massacre is Christy Williams. She shared the moment she participated in unearthing bodies from a mass grave.
We found, it was 8 children. We carried them like in a pallbearers fashion in these cardboard makeshift coffins to the lab, and every time we would pray as we walked with them. But I made a commitment to each of those that I carried that we were going to find who they belonged to, give them a proper burial, and then start the course for justice for them.
The bones of those in that grave and possibly other grave sites still cry out to be heard. Almost 300 people died. 1,200 homes were burned and almost 300 others were looted. 10,000 black people were left homeless and $1.5 million in property damage. Those are the results of the Tulsa riot. Only 2 known survivors are left, and they're still waiting for justice.
103 years later, the victims and their descendants are still fighting for that justice. And though they carry that hope with them every day, they will never forget the hostility and the humiliation.
I'm out here fighting now. I'm going to keep fighting. We have some strong descendants who are still writing the story, telling the story, and keeping it alive.
Christy Williams is one of the leading voices for the victims, including her late great-aunt, Janie Williams, whose stories she shares through her work at Vernon AME Church.
Our story has always been told by the oppressor, by the perpetrator, and so therefore a lot of our history has not been documented. And so there's a lot of historians from around the world who want to know more about this history. Because it's just not written.
In 2021, the Greenwood District became home to a museum highlighting the events of May 31st through June 1st. The museum's director, Raymond Doswell, sharing the center's impacts on Oklahoma and the world.
Unfortunately, the instances of things like the race massacre are not new. They've happened all over the world. They've happened all over the world since 1921. And we need to, at some point, really learn the lessons of treating each other properly and understanding each other so that we can stop racial violence across the world.
Williams, who recently traveled to Berlin, Germany to educate others about Greenwood, says citizens overseas take a different approach to preserving its darkest history.
They taught the descendants of the perpetrators to care. Simply, they taught them to care. They taught them about empathy. And so that's just why their motto is never let this happen again, because it can happen again.
Laws have recently passed to change the way pivotal moments in history are taught, if at all. Greenwood Rising's mission is to keep that history alive through dialogue.
This is the truth. There's no need to debate the truth, and the facts are important in this. Then we can move on and debate other aspects of that as much as possible, and not have the conversation be dominated by one side.
Senator Matthews declined to comment on the current curriculum in public schools across the state, but Doswell says 8th graders in Tulsa public schools are required to visit the museum as part of their education, as are officers in training for the Tulsa Police Department. Meanwhile, Williams is steadily applying pressure on elected officials to tell the victim stories, even those that were never accounted for.
Where the mass grave is now, they were actually looking for just the 18, because there were 18 bodies that was actually documented. Except the mass grave had more than 18, and to date, it's about a little over 60 remains that they found.
There are at least 6 known mass graves across Tulsa holding the remains of unidentified victims. Only one has been explored. This photo of Williams and City Councilor Vanessa Hall Harper sparked the flame to make that happen. I'll never forget the stories of those victims whose remains have since been reburied in the same hole covered by the Tulsa flag. Williams is keeping her fight alive.
Over there in Germany, they wouldn't stand for any of this. So if they can do it, why can't we do it? So it's gonna take people like that to come in here, to come to Tulsa and to push that. They have to be pushed to do it.
This is Greenwood, and it will always be the place of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And now, hundreds of Black people are still here. They're the descendants of those victims, and they're fighting to make sure that those deaths aren't in vain, making sure this moment will always be in history.